Hello everyone, today we talk about Romano-Sasanian warfare from Alexander Severus to Galerius. It's basically an introduction to the main wars and battles fought between these two powers. In very particular context because, as you know, Persia had just essentially passed from the Arsacid to the Sasanian dynasty. We never really made a video about this in a political, cultural sense. We talked here and there about Persian history from sort of many different points of view, but medieval warfare. Recently we talked about Alexander, its conquest, etc. There would be much to say in function of the Romanization of Persia in the previous generations and the Sasanians stepping up in military capacity due to this very heavy exposure to Roman warfare. Of course, there are some cycles that stem from crisis, reactivation of power. The Sasanians basically went after the old Achaemenid model, right? And they tried to, and succeeded actually, to restore Persia as a proper universal scale, potentially universally scaled empire, became much more aggressive, and by the 4th century, essentially, together with some specific Germanic confederacies, actually the greatest threat to the Roman frontiers, and also basically the type of foe that Rome had never actually had in kind, in also tactical effectiveness and so on. Also strategic, we can't sort of pin one specific point. This is actually worth another video explanation about what we mean by that, because even though Rome did risk up to the Second Punic War to be disarticulated in its sort of Italic confederacy and to basically fall, the enemies that Rome faced in later times were not fundamentally vital. They weren't threatening the existence of the same empire. From especially the 4th century, and that's also why you want to appreciate the Constantinian military reforms and how effective they were, because again, there is a lot of debate comparatively about that as well. Became essentially the best mean to cope with these new threats. This is all debatable in different terms, at least if we analyze the technical skills, the type of flexibility and variety of troops and so on of late antiquity across sort of different cultures. I made a couple of videos on late Roman warfare, and especially this idea that we have somehow that in the later Roman world, kind of sort of military quality had decreased. There are those memes that show you the graph like the noob that says, the late Roman army Sacto was not like the one before, and then more knowledge peaking with the opposite side in the center that says basically, denying a bit the broader picture, saying no, late Roman army was the strongest that Rome ever had, etc. in absolute terms, and then the curve descends once again, and you have the cool guy who says, there had been an actual decline in quality of the late Roman army. It's too big of a topic in general. It also only partially concerns today's video that mostly talks about 3rd century warfare, but much of the changes that eventually would concretize the Diocletian Constantinian era Roman army were there at that point. As always, you can't answer this and similar questions if you don't look at the history, probably the strictly evidential military history of these engagements, which is also the reason why from last year I drastically increased, and at some point we will slow down, we will bring back lots of other kind of topics as far as strategy campaigns are concerned, because we haven't really covered that much. It was really, and still, we haven't this overwhelming amount compared to all the things I've already done of campaign and general sort of strategic analysis of all even the battles that we've seen at some point. So I hope at this point to balance much better. You have always the top fix comment down below that shows all the related topics of the video. And the answer is naturally, when we talk about the general confrontations, mostly political, moral, cultural, all the rest following in a sense, or reflecting it in a way. And that's why, as I was starting from the beginning, the emergence of the Sasanian Empire is key. This was the last pre-Islamic Persian Empire, by the way, ruling from 224 to 651, beginning with Ardashir I's crushing defeat of the last Arsacid king. So we're talking probably the Parthian era, ideally. Artabanus IV at the Battle of Hormozgan. We are on April the 28th, 224. The Persians had always had these feudal clashes within probably the Iranian plateau, because, as you know, the Parthians and the Sasanians later also would try to centralize power, like the Achaemenids had done in the past, by establishing a foothold in Mesopotamia that was far more sort of urbanized, satellite. So it was much better than the Iranian plateau to organize something more strategically and logistically impressive. The Iranian plateau was effervescent but more fragmented, right? You had all these war bands coming from the northeast, the major feudal clans, in fact, of the Persian Empire, in this sort of half-civilized, in some places, especially in the west, very highly civilized, and in the others, even relatively close to that sort of not-so-civilized place. This allowed, in part, for that sort of chivalric, feudal, knightly kick that the Persians had been cultivating from quite a while. So these clashes were also really the norm. The Romans had destroyed the Parthian kingdom, or empire if you prefer, a couple of times. The aforementioned Battle of Hormozgan had taken place on the plain near modern Ram-Hormoz in Khuzestan province, and not only ended the Arsacid dynasty, the old refounders of the Persian Empire, because before there were the Seleucids, it's right there from the time of after Alexander. And they had been, as such, the Arsacids also the ruling house of the Parthian Empire as a whole, from 247 BC so up to 224 AD. Like, it's a pretty long time. It's almost half a millennium. And so it's something grandiose in its own regard. The Parthians had never really been so dramatically effective. Yes, it's true that the Romans would lose to them in sort of catastrophic clashes like Cara and so on, but aside from the fact that Rome was much better shape at the time in general, and even at this point she knew how to defend herself, to say the least. The Parthians had always had a particular and really an exceptional incapacity of, let's say, successfully infiltrating the Levant. Like, if you look at the Judaic revolts, those were all basically backed by the Persians. Right, there is something about, again, established civilization that tries to be unhinged by this sort of less stable regional rival there. And the Persian objective to arrive to the Mediterranean still eludes Iran to this day. So we want to appreciate this. The Sasanians were the ones who went, aside from the Achaemenids back in the day, who went the furthest. Right, and with, in fact, an unprecedented level of aggressiveness. The Sasanians had, at this point, accepted some Roman turncoats into their ranks. This had apparently also fixed the chronic polyurcetic incapacity of the Parthians that were mocked in the ancient world because they were not good at besieging fortresses, even though they had actually the best cataphracts that had ever been devised in a quite expandably effective sense. Not even the Sasanians later will have the same cataphract tradition of the Parthians. People tend to sort of miss this point, that cataphracts at some point became too heroic, too champion-like, too expensive for also a more scaled original force like the one the Sasanians now were putting together. Right. You also have to here make an abstraction effort in realizing what probably the scale of power ratio was with Rome, because Persia was actually the weaker power. Even in times of expansion at at some point, as you know, later into the early Middle Ages, even threatening properly Constantinople, etc. The Eastern grip on all these various lands were somehow scarce, right? If you look at the core of sort of Persian power, this was basically fundamentally just Iran, right? And just part of Mesopotamia, depending on sort of how successful the Persians really were. The Roman Empire worked in a completely different way. It was more robust. It was more populated, it was more structured, not just in size, but talking in relative terms to different regions. And even though you can definitely topple a regime, you can destabilize a state, whatever, the Persians would make a lot of damage to the Romans, but would never actually be able to succeed against it. And this is a systemic dynamic as well. The Persians are good at launching massive raids in this sort of steppe vibe kind of offensives, but to hold ground is a completely different matter. And the Romans actually are better at it. They have the better settlements. They, in any case, have the better military, telling the truth, right? It is not like the Persians are not intimidating at this point in history. And the Arsacids had governed essentially a pretty scattered realm, blending Persian, Hellenistic, and regional elements through a feudal system of vassal kings. We've also made a video about sort of the Romano-Armenian war that was actually with the Parthians at the time of Nero, that shows you how things fundamentally worked at the time. Well, in all of this, the Sasanians emerged as new founders of a Persian state, directly inspired in scale and ambition to the Achaemenid era, that also lived very much in this place. There had been, again, changed to an extent. The same Arsacid military had things like, I don't know, Turiel, they had much more infantry, for example, than also, especially at the beginning of their conquest, and would sort of develop later. I was hinting before at all the history of sort of cataphract development. It's something that we'll treat better in sort of distinguished sort of military historical unit videos. The Sasanians, this is very important, deliberately presented themselves as the legitimate continuation of the Achaemenid tradition. It was really a new Persian cycle reboot to an extent. Sasanian rulers saw thus themselves as the rightful successor to figures such as Cyrus the Great, Darius III. They adopted even part of their own iconography back from they really wanted to show the Romans that Persia had come back. The explanation of this, again, is for another video, because it would be difficult to understand. Part of this actually derived from the same internal Roman crisis, so these powers would have likely not reactivated hadn't there been something going on. But the rise of the Sasanian dynasty is also antecedent to the 3rd century crisis, right? In general, realize this, that the Roman Empire was central to anyone living in Western Eurasia, right? There wasn't another power that could essentially present another pole, an alternative pole to Rome, not even Persia at this point. The entire Western Eurasia, Mediterranean, North Africa, Red Sea, etc. The Romans had some temples dedicated to Augustus in Malabar because of their mercantile presence. On the western coast of India, they reached China. Everything revolved around Rome, right? The Persians could essentially try to destabilize the eastern half, especially the Asian part of the empire, to even penetrate Africa at some point, but not much more than that. And so their attempts were paradoxically more pressured, more desperate, right? They were eager to exploit every single weakness the Romans showed, because they knew also that their own establishment was fundamentally more fragile. They, however, asserted claims to territories long held by the Roman Empire, including the provinces of Asia Minor and the Near East, as far as the Aegean Sea and the Propontis. Telling the truth, the Arsacids had tried again to extend themselves toward that as well. So there is a great continuity. But under the Sasanians, it's all more explicit and direct, right? By largely dismissing the Parthian period as an illegitimate interruption, The Sasanians pursued a far more assertive expansionistic policy than their Arsacid predecessors, as well, leading to campaigns that penetrated Roman defenses more frequently and with greater success. Ardashir's early efforts focused on Upper Mesopotamia, where he captured the key fortified cities of Nisibis and Carrhae on the eastern Roman frontier. The latter settlement naturally very much loaded in sort of symbolical value for Persian power against Rome. These gains had already started in the final phase of Maximinus Thrax's reign. I made a couple of videos about Maximinus. You can get a gist of what was going on between the provincials, the Italians. At this point, still Rome, Italy, was very much like central to everything. There wasn't even properly an idea that things were to shift from a century to another. All right, and actually, we tend to dramatize that a bit too much, right? We should understand things that sort of, I hate the term pole, or polycentric, or whatever, but the fact that the Roman Empire was actually a cluster of regions, it's sort of more effective as a picture, historically wise, than thinking there's just a central power, that Rome always ruled from a simple technical center and did not rely on the various governors of the provinces in a very autonomous fashion from the latter side. Now, Ardashir's operations also included unsuccessful sieges at Dura Europos, a Hellenistic-founded fortified city on the Euphrates in Syria that later came under Parthian and Roman control and is famous for its multicultural art blending Greek, Roman, Parthian, and local influences, as well as the earliest known synagogue and Christian house church, and possibly Antioch as well, on the Orontes, the major metropolis of Roman Syria. These steps are quite relevant. I made a couple of videos about, in particular, Cappadocia, the Roman province. We stopped to the 3rd century there, but those lands are very exotic. Right, the Romans basically in the East follow on the footstep of the Greeks that are fundamentally still ruling the place under Rome as a sort of superior people to the others. There is this more sort of continental Mashrek interland that, however, is something really rough, very different. It's historically structured by millennia of steppe people's invasions that, in a sense, the same Persian ones kept fueling, at least, and were sort of the product of, to a degree, politically. These places are much more difficult to control because there isn't a familiar interland, right? People are much less Romanized. They start probably departing in from the Hellenistic Mediterranean facies, so to say, that Rome relied on. With, in fact, a core Mediterranean region is very well, as we said before, also fortified, garrisoned. Rome has consistent amount of legions there, and naturally already is already habituated to cope with these issues that seem, however, relatively, and they are relatively peripheral. Dura Europos is also very famous because of the frescoes, the weaponry found there. There's a very archaeological background to that. At some point we will make a video about it. But much of this is also, at this point in history, the clashes between the Romans and the Sasanians. The most significant achievement of the Sasanians in this oriental frontier was the capture of Atra. We're in 240 or 241. It's not clear. That's also a thing. Like, these places are distant also from a documentary historiographical point of view. Had this happened, I don't know, in Europe, we would know much better. But this event is relevant because it coincides also with the coronation of Ardashir's son Shapur I as co-regent, according to the Cologne Manning Codex. Hatra was a strongly fortified Semitic kingdom in the Jazira Desert of northern Iraq. These, in particular, with the establishment of the, let's say, of the Roman Empire in the Levant, had turned into properly frontier areas, whereas historically they had functioned as core lands of empires. Think about the Seleucid one, And before that, naturally, Alexander, the Achaemenids, the Assyrians, so everything had been fairly contiguous for a long time. We underestimate a bit the structuration, the stabilization of these areas historically at this point, and how they had turned into sort of more permeable areas. Atra had functioned, in fact, as a semi-autonomous buffer state between the Roman and Parthian empires, initially under the latter's influence before shifting allegiance to Rome under Sanatruk II, with evidence of a small Roman garrison from Latin inscriptions dated to 235. These are, again, very distant, faraway places, very close to probably more an Asian dimension than a Mediterranean one. And the city had previously withstood sieges by Trajan in 117. We'll look at those campaigns in some videos. And by Septimius Severus in 193 and 197. After all, the frontier had been important enough at a point to be stabilized by this imperial expedition. Now, after a prolonged investment lasting 1 year, according to most sources, or 2, as reported by sort of much later Islamic era source of Al-Tabari, the Sasanians finally overwhelmed its defenses. Think even regarding the latter, note how much we depend on, for example, Islamic historiography concerning a big deal of these regions that, in fact, later would be properly lost to a Western documentation. That's something we tend to underplay. We made some videos about sort of the Byzantine loss of these territories to the Arabs, the fact that there were some Christian communities that kept living on in these places, but the fact that at some point these regions sort of fell under a non-Western power, and in this sense under regimes that were not so actually prolific in sort of autonomous, almost liberal historiographical criticism, analysis, and so on, prevents us from knowing a big deal even from these ancient nodes. We do know at some point that even these wars, especially in the Islamic, so-called Islamic Golden Age, knew much more, in fact, about the local history than naturally people living in Europe, but somehow this faded away. There is an enormous amount of legions of Alexander, but even, for example, a lot of Hellenistic knowledge, including apparent expeditions to, there are very interesting studies on this subject, for example, to Iceland of some Hellenic explorer that eventually were lost throughout Islamic times, and that you can find references to even very far away into even East Asia at Similia. All right. And so there are different stages of development historically that also mold the way we see certain periods accordingly. The Sasanians systematically plundered the city, destroying its fortifications. We're talking Atra here. And that left it permanently abandoned. The kingdom was dissolved entirely by 363. Ammianus Marcellinus described Atra as a long deserted ruin in an uninhabited region. These were very ancient settlements, by the way, millenary history that sort of decayed in this fashion. Now, later medieval Arabic and Persian accounts also add the romantic legend of the princess al-Nadira betraying the city to Shapur out of love. You may never know how these things would happen, because these places were very proto-feudal, if you want to call feudal what existed in the Middle Ages, minded. All right, the same way the Romans ruled over these places was very much, again, decentralized, and much of these peoples lived in a suspense state in between the two empires, not being fully part of either. But these were paradoxically closer in culture to the Persians than to the Romans, under which they were most of the time. Now, these territorial advances occurred while the Roman Empire struggles with the internal stability of the 3rd century crisis, and they directly provoked the large-scale counteroffensive launched by Emperor Gordian III. That is the first major expedition of that this video covers from the Roman side. So the Roman army basically drew on legions stationed along the eastern limes, including the 15th Apollinaris at Satala, the 12th Fulminata at Melitene in Cappadocia, the 3rd Parthic at Nisibis, the 1st Parthic at Singara in Mesopotamia, the 4th Sitica at Zeugma, the 16th Flavia Firma at Sura, and the 2nd Parthic at Apamea in Syria Cele, the 3rd Gallica at Danaba in Syria Phoenicia, the 10th Fretensis at Aelia Capitolina, and the 6th Ferrata at Caparcotna in Syria Palestina, plus the 3rd Cyrenaica at Bosra in Arabia Petrea. You understand, it's part of a massive system of defense that stretches from the Caucasus to the Red Sea, and that has an ambition here also to reach sort of the other side of Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, the Persian Zagros foothills, etc. Now, this pre-existing deployment force was substantially reinforced on the occasion of the expedition by vexillationes from the Danubian and Western fronts, including units such as the 1st Adutrix, the 4th Italica, the 1st Italica, the 1st Minervia, the 2nd Adutrix, the 3rd Italica, the 4th Flavia Felix, the 5th Macedonica. I'm talking ecclesiastical here because sort of the 3rd century is a bit ideally, sort of conventionally, the watershed across classical pronunciation. The 7th Claudia Pia Fidelis, the 8th Augusta, the 10th Gemina, the 11th Claudia Pia Fidelis, the 14th Gemina, 22nd Primigenian, and 30th Ulpia Traiana Victrix, along with contingents of Gothic and Germanic warriors. Two things we have seen also the army of Gallienus, what was going on with the vexillationes that were not an invention of the time. They existed from quite a while, were simply sort of units under a vexillum. The Romans tend to fragment a little bit more these forces to recompact major sort of frontiers in times in which these were becoming a bit more turbulent. You see here the Goths and the Germans. If you wonder why they're separated, well, because aside from their history, the Romans called them separately, right? The Goths were basically this Irano-Germanic people with lots of other elements in it that mostly operated across the Danube, where in fact the first island of Germanic warriors were settled proper from the Gothic conglomeration that at this point was yet to properly and fully coalesce in something more sort of even recognizable. If you think about the Tervingi de Greutungi, even it's a sort of simplification, but we will talk more about Gothic history at some point, and I made a video specifically about these first islands of Germanic warriors, especially on the Danubian frontier. They were technically understood as subjects, except they were local forces that had not been diluted, essentially, like in the past, like what Romans normally settled certain Germanic groups and scattered them a bit better across. It had always been the case, but at this point, with the Gothic pressure, there are some properly sacs that are not dilutable. And so it's not really something new what you see at Adrianople, right? Even though that was much more clamorous in a way, and you have an entire province settled by what we call the Visigoths, and what would actually be created in the Illyricum by the Romans after they settled. However, this is a typical composition of a Roman army at of the time. So you have this case, the troops from the theater where the war had to be fought, with lots of, here we talk about different legions, for example, but it's not like even in the East, they all participated together, right? There were always some garrison forces. There was an increasing sedentarization of the legions themselves in these places. So this is also not the video to discuss it, but say that later concept of limitane or ripenses was already there. Here, for example, you see the Orontes as a riverway frontier and so on, and certain legions had been stationed literally for centuries. It was good, however, also from the Western units to participate, and so at least part of them was sent in the East to acquire military experience, which is also always something you want to obtain for your military, even though here the need is eminently strategic in the moment against the Sasanians. Some say that the total force could have at least numbered between 150 and 170,000 men, roughly equally divided still between legionaries and auxiliaries. Again, the difference between the latter two, was gradually dissipating. Also, the numbers here in the hundreds of thousands naturally refers to the forces that were alerted, right? Not even necessarily the ones mobilized for the campaign. So it was actually multiple armies, as we explained. You can't control even more than 50,000 men in a tactically proficient way, or something that makes any military logical sense, right? But altogether, of course, essentially the concept was sending a massive force approaching even those 50,000 and having essentially reserves behind, which is sort of also very basic strategical precaution, because this was to be a big thing. In contrast, the Sasanian armies under Shapur I relied primarily on cavalry drawn from the nobility. Their retinues, you have the core cataphract essentially plus horse archers. There were also infantry, and we will see it now, but they were sort of less consistent. And the entire Mashraq actually had sort of some kind of medium infantry, also good mountaineers and so on. Forces that can and will help, but let's say for pitched battles and also the general harassment of the bigger enemy that Rome was, you need mounted troops. And these men were trained from childhood in archery and horsemanship, benefit from more efficient recruitment systems that allowed prolonged service, meaning that they lived a bit on horseback, right? They were continuously involved into this local feuds between the various Persian clans. That is not necessarily, oh my god, they're so experienced, because their political disunity is at the end of the day the major flaw in this Persian context. In any case, they had already assimilated Roman siege techniques much better than their Parthian predecessors already. They had stepped up compared to our Sassanid times. Naturally, we can imagine in a very non-tranchant way that also the Parthians had historically improved at siege war, because they literally came from the steppes, right? From the ones stretching especially east of the Caucasus. We've seen them recently also in the campaign of Alexander towards Bactria, right? Now the campaign began in 243 when Gordian's forces, under the direction of the Praetorian prefect Timesitheus, these are Hellenistic names typical of later empire, assembled at Antioch, that was the biggest base, the capital of Syria, and an unavoidable point of passage there, crossed the Euphrates, that constituted de facto like the border, at least of the directly Roman directly controlled territory of the empire, and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Persians at Rezena, near modern Ceylan Pinar. They're very rugged territory, very difficult sort of places to operate also for the Sasanians, because they're also fairly west. And again, don't think that the Persians consider, again, these territories as home, that their home lays back further. In fact, this victory forced the Sasanians to withdraw eastward, and allowed the Romans to recover Nisibis and Singara. Emboldened, they planned an advance on the Sasanian capital Ctesiphon, the grand metropolis on the Tigris River near modern Baghdad that served as the primary royal capital and coronation city for both the Parthian and Sasanian empires over more than 8 centuries, and was renowned as a multicultural trade hub with impressive palaces. Of course, 8 centuries, I mean, it had already been an important center back in the day, even before the Parthians. Very few remains of Ctesiphon notoriously, and this is exactly the center where, in particular, the Sasanian dynasty, as an imperial one, tends to centralize in a land, again, it was very different from Persia, from this urban, massive statal, right, Mesopotamian dimension. It's very, again, also privatistic, oligarchic. It's sort of not so statally orderly like the Roman one, but it's in fact as such a very important symbol of probably the cohesive capacity of the Sasanians to constitute a credible threat against Rome in the east. It's a bit like the launching pad, without which also the Iranian potential could have not been successfully employed. The sudden death of Timesitheus from illness disrupted the command structure and allowed Philip the Arab to take over as prefect, right? Famous figure that we'll talk about a bit better next some point. Zosimus, who was openly hostile towards Philip, describes how the new prefect rose from humble origins, deliberately ordered supply ships to move inland, creating shortages that stirred discontent among the troops wintering at Carrhae and Nisibis. These are the phases of sort of provincial issues emerging probably within the crisis of the 3rd century, and Philip the Arab will become actually Emperor of Rome. He came from this incredibly rugged and dark, it seems like Mordor, kind of Hoggar place. I wouldn't be surprised if Tolkien actually took inspiration from that landscape. It was really dark, really, it's something, and it expresses a bit probably the nature of these men, of the Arabs that had been within the empire from quite a while, especially, of course, the ones in the north. From the other side, as you know, the Sasanians co-opted part of their Arabs from their own sort of Persian, in fact, Gulf side. And there are these already, you see, local attachments, kind of exploitation of the situations that are not to the effects of sort of Roman cohesiveness otherwise. And there is this major showdown during the campaign taking place at Miziche between January the 13th and March the 14th, 244, in the vicinity of modern Al-Anbar or Fallujah. We don't know exactly. Now, Shapur's forces won at this point a comprehensive victory. As proclaimed in his trilingual inscription at Naqsh-e Rustam, the ancient necropolis near Persepolis, featuring Achaemenid royal tombs and Sasanian rock reliefs. They are known sort of as the Res Gesta Divi Saporis, written in Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek, detailing, so because, of course, there is this imperial ambition that wanted to mirror, right, the Roman emperors. And in fact, these works detail Shapur's victories over 3 Roman emperors. I will see it now. We don't know the details of these operations, or at least we do. We don't have enough time to digress on this, but let's say not in such a comprehensively detailed fashion that as we would like. When you look at these Eastern engagements, there's always a sense of ambiguity. We've seen it's not the first Eastern campaign we document. Think about the one of Antony in Parthia. You can say, well, yes, this was a defeat. Okay, the war against for Armenia that we've seen in Nero's times. Yes, sort of victory, defeat. There is a balance swinging here and there, but there is hardly ever like a massive, decisive, crashing victory. At some point, it does happen, and will happen, as we'll see now. But more than else, there is a continuous harassment, confrontation, delay, and mostly also because the Sasanians are not so confident against the Romans, historically speaking. This inscription asserts, by the way, that Gordian was killed, the Roman army destroyed, and Philip forced to pay Philip the Arab 500,000 denarii to ransom prisoners while accepting tributary status, right? Which is also somehow unlikely in a big, whatever that meant. An outcome commemorated by renaming the site Perod's Shapur as well. And what do the Romans tell us? Well, their sources consistently avoided admitting the defeat, right? Portraying the expedition as at least partially successful, and attributing Gordian's death variously to a plot by Philip, wounds from a fall from his horse with death at Zaitha, or direct combat as well. But it is plausible in this sense, because, again, the notion that propaganda side, like this for both sides, that would have been this climatic show, and it does not align with the norm. We're sure that there's going to be a final clash in which, like, also Gordian died, whatever, but the strategic balance may have been much more complicated than this. The Historia Augusta records a multilingual cenotaph inscription at Circensium that ironically lists Gordian's victories over Persians, Goths, Sarmatians, and Germans, but omits any conquest over Philip, for example. Contemporary coinage reflects the tensions. Sesterzi from 243-44 show Gordian and Tranquillina, his wife, on the obverse with reverses depicting Thika and the Sagittarius symbolizing the first Partica legion at Singara, while Philip's Antoniniani proclaim, quote, Pax fundata cum Persis. Despite the effective cession of Armenia and Mesopotamia and the appointment of his brother Priscus as Rector Orientis. Right? So whatever happened wasn't particularly good for the Romans, but it seemingly wasn't a complete disaster as one may think. A period of relative calm, by the way, followed until Shapur launched his second major campaign, 252. Citing Roman incursions into Armenia, he annihilated a Roman army of allegedly 60,000 men, that again is not quite the case, at Barbalissus near Aleppo and the Euphrates through superior tactics, opening the Syrian provinces to unrestricted raiding. This was surely a consistent Roman force that was crushed by the Sasanians that swarmed across the Syrian countryside and culminated, because of lack of effective Roman resistance, to the sack of the same Antioch, possibly on multiple occasions even, between 253 and 256, along with widespread devastation in Cilicia, so further northwest, and Cappadocia, further northeast instead. This was, however, not a campaign of conquest. It shows, as we were saying before, what it was really typical of Persian power to manage to inflict these blows and partially infiltrate Roman defenses. By the way, we are in the heart, probably in the eye of the storm of the 3rd century crisis. So the Persians were, here we don't talk about the general context, but they were definitely exploiting a moment of massive Roman destabilization. Technically, the Roman Empire could have ended at this point, or it could have sort of been ramped in, or had much greater time to recover. The fact that things went the way we know instead shows also how relatively limited the Persian potential really was. But Shapur is, as you know, a great hero in Persian epos because of his victories over the Romans. The third, most important one for its outcome, was the one in 260. In fact, Emperor Valerian, who had worked to restore order in the east after the defeat of the usurper Aemilianus, was hampered by plague. In a Gothic naval incursion that ravaged Pontus and Cappadocia, the Goths were pretty disturbing at this point in their naval power that the Greutungi Goths had established essentially in today's Ukraine, Crimea, devastating mostly the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Right, we recently saw in early Frankish warfare how even West Germans could take ships and carry out their own odyssey across the Mediterranean, similarly. But the Goths were more systemically consistent. That were also the greatest Germanic power at that point. Again, Irano-Germanic, if you want, we'll talk again about those peoples and their military culture. Is very, very interesting. So this was not an optimal situation. Valerian, thus, with this sort of exposed flanks logistically, marched eastward to cope with the Persian threat, alongside a composite army drawn from nearly every part of the empire and reinforced by Germanic allies as well, because there are always lots of sort of Germanic invaders as much as there are auxiliaries. There are often also the same people telling the truth. And the armies met between Carre and Edessa, fateful location. Again, there are some crossroads in military history that, as geopolitics does not really exist, but powers do have an extension that often overlaps also with different in different times in history. It is as you know, it's a major city in Osroene. We talked about these places, even just think about the Crusades era and so on. It's modern Ufa in southeastern Turkey, but from essentially the Mesopotamian side. Shapur's forces encircled and completely destroyed the Roman army. This was big, right? This was really like a very heavy blow, a massive defeat inflicted by the Sasanians on the Romans. The tactics were a bit always similar. Also, the general strategy in the days prior is sort of attritional preparation, right, where the Persians adequately softened up the Roman army to eventually deal the final strike. Valerian was captured alive, right? This is what sort of we always recall, also because of the art we will see now that depicts him in Persian iconography propaganda. The first time, by the way, a Roman emperor fell into enemy hands. So a massive damage to the metaphysical properly identity of the Roman Empire, when that elevated ipso facto the Sasanians to that sort of level of competitive scale, right? By the way, Valerian was captured along with high-ranking officials, so basically all the Roman command was taken. Shapur claimed to have accomplished this personally, as depicted in his cameos and reliefs, where he literally fights like in his idealized Persian championship ways if he had properly fought in a horse duel Valerian himself, right? That is also similar in these cameos to the actual depictions of Valerian, but it's very interesting. It makes you think also how well these peoples knew one another. Of course, Valerian had been captured. I mean, probably the way of representing him, the way also, in this sense, showing, imagine this thing circulating across the Roman Empire at some point. Look, this is your own leader here. And this victory naturally enabled further advances because it was quite critical for the Romans, including the capture of Caesarea and Cappadocia. As you know, very crucial fortress in the Cappadocian highlands that is a bit like the cornerstone for so many different directions, for the south in Syria, for the east in Armenia, from the west and further Anatolian hinterland. And the deportation of perhaps allegedly, telling the truth, 400,000 inhabitants for resettlement in southern Persian provinces. Surely these were less, right? We can imagine tens of thousands, surely hundreds of thousands seems really a bit too much. But what mattered really here is captured Roman personnel, including engineers, contributing further their expertise to projects such as the Banda Kaiser Dam near ancient Shushtar, an arc bridge dammed complex in Khuzestan that represents the easternmost surviving example, in fact, of Roman bridge and dam design, because this had been built properly by Roman prisoners of war. Roman prisoners of war in Persian service are an incredibly fascinating topic. I partially discussed in Chinese history because at some point the Parthians had clashed with the Chinese after Kara, and seemingly, at least from the description of certain equipment, some soldiers had been sent to the northeastern frontier, were equipped with sort of a bit like what the Roman legionnaires at the time looked like, according to the sources. So it's been hypothesized that those Roman prisoners of war were used to fight against the Chinese. The deportation of inhabitants, as we've seen, is also important, presumably not much to stiffen Persian economy in general, but to undermine properly the Roman basis of power, to create some broader vacuum, some more deserted area in between the frontiers, so not to damage mostly the Roman logistics in capacity of foraging and supplying their own bulkier forces. Because at the end of the day, it was the Persians that were lighter and could also just, again, carry out these raids because they literally foraged step by step, but also in this more improvised way and just strategic circumstances allowing, right? This dam at Band Kaiser, by the way, was not just built using Roman prisoners of war captured with Valerian, but it integrated irrigation, water diversion, and crossing functions within the Shushtar historical hydraulic system. It was already a thing. The Persians and other cultures, especially in the East, used mostly subterranean aqueducts, and they were massive and impressive. However, the Romans added on top, like, probably their elite expertise in these forms of plumbing and probably engineering, architectural feats. Accounts of Valerian's treatment after capture vary widely, from relatively dignified conditions to extreme humiliation as a human footstool or even a stuffed trophy preserved in a temple. His capture triggered a profound crisis, obviously, in the Roman Empire, sparking a series of revolts that temporarily fragmented imperial authority, including the establishment of the Gallic Empire under Postumus in the west. And it was not really a separatist entity, unlike Palmyra, as we'll see now. There's various usurpations in the east. It was basically just the Gallo-Romans saying, okay, well, we are aligned with the empire, but we take over as far as our own administration is concerned, mostly also to stem the Germanic tribes from the Rhine to launch incursions deep into Gaul, and therefore mind our own business that is in line, at least, with also territorial preservation of the empire. In the East, it was different, because as we just explained, while, Gaul was fundamentally very deeply Romanized and even sort of ethno-linguistically engineered over the centuries and was aligned with sort of that broader Latin legacy, the East was really a foreign land, an alien land. And especially in the frontier where the Persians, in fact, were attacking, because most of the issue is political. It's also who's going to support you if you launch this invasion. There were plenty of Roman subjects in the East that winked at the Easterners. And it's something that happened also later in time when the Byzantines lost, for example, Egypt to the Arabs, right? When gates were properly opened to them. This is also the context after Valerian's debacle, where forces associated with Odenatus of Palmyra succeeded in repulsing the remaining Sasanian incursions. This is almost paradoxical because, as we just explained, they had definitely risen to power in probably the aftermath of the Roman destabilization, but also they did not want this Levantine power to simply be controlled by somebody else. They struggled for their own autonomy. As you see here, the Sasanians, yes, exploit these guys, but it's a big objective, right, accomplished here for them to have undermined a Roman power for also many other reasons. The empire is under attack. It's a sort of total mess. And you have a prolonged period of equilibrium, at least if we look at Rome and the East, because, as you know, there is all the Palmyran Empire thing, basically almost all of Levant, right? Anatolia and Egypt included, rose against the empire, and this was really an aggressive kind of pernicious thing, very much unlike the so-called empire of the Galli, the Gauls. Aurelian arrives, steamrolls everyone, and restores the world, the universe, with Rome at its center. So in order to find, and this, of course, brought to a massive sort of restabilization of the world, where the Sasanians had to basically go back at their place at the same time. So you see, there isn't any strategic breakthrough capable of destructuring this major Mediterranean base of power, right? On the contrary, we find a prolonged period of equilibrium followed until the accession of Naqsh-e, that is the youngest son of Shapur I and former governor of Sakistan, Turan, and Hind. We're talking probably the easternmost and northeasternmost territories of the empire. Recently made a video of the Sasanian Empire about the Sasanian Heptalite Wars that happened a bit later in history, but Sakistan, made lots of videos about the Sakas, also within the Achaemenid Empire. We talked about them in the video about Alexander, recently together with the same parties of the ancestors of these dynasties, because technically also the Sasanians were sort of descending from the Parthians and so on. It's a complicated history, but you see the places are kind of almost always the same, right? And the idea that the heir to the Persian throne had to build his muscles in the northeast against those steppe peoples that in theory were the gold standard also military capacity that, if you remember in the videos we made about Achaemenid power in the area, um, the same Persians identified themselves as kin, right? They were all the subject peoples of the entire world. I don't know, the Chaldeans, the Arabs, etc. And then on top of that were all the nomadic peoples, including the Persians, ideally nomadic, and these other populations that were thought to be probably of a superior kind, because these originally were all steppe conquerors, right? This is valid, as we've seen, also for, I don't know, the Romans will become, back in the day, the Greeks. So it's big stuff, and it's fascinating to see how these cultures echo with one another as far as their Indo-European ancestry. Naqsh initiated renewed hostilities with Rome in 296-297 by invading Western Armenia and Mesopotamia. It's almost always the same theaters, right? He achieved an initial victory over Galerius in the region between Carrhae and Callinicum, while Diocletian was occupied suppressing the Egyptian revolt of Domitius Domitianus. We'll look at that at some point. It's also fascinating and connected with some issues, also with some local populations, the Blamies, etc. Now, Galerius, reinforced with troops from the Illyrican recruiting grounds and cooperating with the restored Armenian king Tiridates III, that is to say, the Arsacid rule. This was a branch of the old Arsacids, who reigned from about 298 to about 330, by the way. Respectable reign for such day and age. Reclaimed the Armenian throne as a Roman client after Galerius's crushing victory over Naqsh, and laid the groundwork for Armenia to adopt Christianity as the state religion. Exploiting the rack terrain also of the country in 298 to launch a counteroffensive. This is particularly fascinating because you see, again, Galerius and this Arsacid puppet ruler that, as you know, at this point, Galerius was coping with Christians himself in the Eastern Empire. It was all a moment of extending or partially repressing the Christians, part providing them with sort of liberty of cult and so on. We'll also talk about this at some point. The Illyrican or Illyrian troops are the consequence of the almost remilitarization of the Roman Empire. And so when you look at the army of Diocletian or Constantine's times, etc., we realize that this was partly the fruit of the aforementioned restoration of Aurelian, of these so-called Illyrian generals, because they came from the historical region of Illyricum that was historical as far as the Roman province went, but they were also Celto-Roman to a degree. Those were the same places where the Scordisci had been leaving. And these peoples had remained sort of more primitive. They, in this sense, they were not very florid areas historically. That the Danube was largely sort of a military frontier, not with a great expansion. And these areas were historically more exposed, especially to the Gothic incursion. So the local establishment was, first of all, sensitive to these attacks, had garnered military experience, also in terms of local defenses, autonomy, counter-strikes, and so on. And in general, from a social point of view, these rugged mountaineers from what today would be sort of the Serbian hinterland, basically, would make excellent recruits. The Roman army would see that, given their poor socioeconomical background, as a viable career. Right, and in fact, they basically come to dominate the empire. There are plenty of Illyrian emperors, including Constantine and Diocletian and so on. It's difficult not to see this rebooting also of the Roman Empire in this late antique phase on the basis of this military restoration. under the Illyrian rule. The empire was the same old one. Again, continuity is much stronger than we commonly think, but in many ways the face of the empire had changed due to this man. Speaking of Galerius's, in fact, Romano-Armenian counteroffensive in 298, first of all, local support enabled surprise attacks culminating in another engagement in the Bazayan region at Osksai near Satala. It's basically it's a historical Armenia, but it's part of the Anatolian Plateau, basically in far northeast. Roman forces here struck an unprepared Persian encampment during the day, inflicting a massacre that captured the royal treasury, harem, and Narses' principal wife Arsane, who later resided in a suburb of Daphne near Antioch as a visible symbol of defeat. Right? When you say a wife trophy, this is what she factually became. This was very important. As you see, Valerian is depicted in sort of different Sasanian iconography propaganda. Equally, here the Romans were doing the same with the sort of the wife. Just the other day, made a video about how the victorious hero gains the empire by taming and possessing the golden woman, so to say, the one of the golden bow, the myth of the Rex Nemorensis that gives properly full deity, virility, manhood to the ruler of the world, right? And here, the very wife had been stripped from that ruler by the Romans that were obviously very glad to exploit the situation in morals. So that was a heavy blow, in fact, for the Persians as well, in fact. Narse himself escaped wounded on a swift pony, and he must have been thinking about sort of the old Persian adage that even just a lie had the Holy Ghost flying away with his winged glory. And even a minimal fault would make you collapse from one day to another. By the way, it's important to see here that the guy had a wife, but also a harem, which sort of predates certain other practices that continued in Islamic time. Now, because let's be honest, the Arabs in the early Islamic time drew almost everything from Persia, right? Also in terms of concept of holy war, and even though in a sort of more sort of superficial sense, I mean, a people that ignores the Trinity, like at that point, cannot claim any Indo-European legacy for that matter. But this is a topic for another theological history video. The Romans were doing well, so Galerius advanced through Media and Adiabene. These are in the northeast of sort of above Mesopotamia, like in the Mashrek. And so going further east from Armenia, that as we've seen here was friendly with Rome, becoming also before Rome, way before Rome, because that would happen only at the end of the 4th century, the first proper Christian state in history. The Romans won victories near Resina and Nisibis before October the 1st, proceeding down the Tigris to briefly capture Ctesiphon before withdrawing via the Euphrates. So the Romans marched and did other things on Ctesiphon that, of course, the Persians would never do with Rome, but not even with Byzantium for that matter. The strategy here is fascinating because in other times in history we've seen these very theaters. For example, the Battle of Manzikert was fought in a time where the Byzantines were really from Armenia that had been consolidated, always a frontier area, would open in fact to the Tigris Valley and so on. We've seen it also recently in the video about Harald Ardradan's service of Constantinople. And from there, the Romans at this point had all the massive strategic projection that in fact later Byzantines would not have to literally march in there on Ctesiphon. It's as if the Byzantines had marched on Baghdad at some point, just to make you understand. And this was big, it was epic, it was glorious, was seen as, you're nothing, basically, compared to Rome. And underscores, indeed, Sasanian weakness at the end of the day. You understand even how the greatest Persian victories were the fruit of certain contingencies, right? Definitely not lacking ability or power or whatever, but always struggling against a much more grounded Roman Empire. Here the Romans did more or less what Shapur I had done with Antioch, right? Plundering its suburbs, the city, at some point extracting tribute and so on. Here the Romans do their damage, and then they come back to Armenia across the Euphrates. They made a detour, also because these armies really consume a lot of forage, a lot of local resources. So you go down the Tigris Valley, you destroy Ctesiphon, but you rise up once again through the Euphrates Valley, because there's fresh resources. At some point, these regional campaigns could literally exacerbate the situation locally, exhausting a generation worth of economical production, right? So they were really devastating. The ancient world was rich, but it was still essentially a very fragile pre-industrial agricultural world. And think of how far away these places are, right? These are the same places you see, I don't know, the Americans with palms during the Gulf War. That's where the Romans routinely went on fighting at this point in history. Now, this success was celebrated. Galerius was a great commander, with commemorative medallions, coin issues, and the triumphal arch erected famously in Thessalonica in 304 is one of the major attractions there. We know largely also of these expeditions and their success, etc., through these sources of propaganda, of iconography, of properly public display of power. We've seen it from the same Persian side. Naqsh at this point sent the envoy Apharban to seek peace and the return of his family. Though initially rebuffed, the offer led to negotiations at Nisibis in the spring of 299. The Romans had leverage and wanted to exploit it, of course. This negotiation was conducted by the Magister Memoriae Sicorius Probus. The terms were highly favorable to Rome: cession of 5 Transtigrian satrapies, variously identified as these Sasanian held at this point provinces of Ingilene, Sophene, Arzanene, Corduene, and Zabdicene. They will have this suffix, or including Moxoene and Reimene. These were just sort of not even fully provincial realities, but altogether they were an important buffer area that went to Rome, that also got the Tigris recognized as the mutual frontier between the two empires. The extension of Armenian territory to the fortress of Zinta in Media Atropatene, so we are basically in the east, and so it's an eastern expansion of the Armenian kingdom. That is very, as you know, orographically complex. It's full of castles, a very feudal area. It does really resemble a lot the Iranian plateau in certain things, and in fact, it's also very heavily Persified in culture from quite a long time. Rome also obtained the transfer of suzerainty over Iberia, that, as you know, was an important province of the Caucasus where the Persians had routinely tried to infiltrate. Rome had, at this point, the right to appoint the kings of Iberia from the Sasanians, and also the designation of Nisibis as the sole legal entrepot for trade between the empires, so that more or less Rome could have a better access to the intercontinental trade routes that from, in fact, China to the empire crossed Persia as well. So this tells you how sort of heavy at this point the Roman comeback really was. The Sasanians, of course, did not, as we explained before, directly control these places. Normally they control them through sort of sub-kings and sort of vassals, etc. But still, the fact that Rome could project back this power at the expenses of the Persians is quite telling. Naqsh's diplomatic message likened the Roman and Persian kingdoms to two luminaries that should illuminate rather than destroy one another. A very beautiful message, if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, the Persians didn't really believe much of that when it was convenient for them. The Sasanian ruler expressed acceptance of the moderate demands and gratitude for the respectful treatment of his captured family. That probably was not even worth it if not for his own rule, because, of course, it was a very politically shameful circumstance, as we pointed out before. The treaty secured approximately 4 decades of peace, so it was also a very lasting one, during which Diocletian strengthened the eastern fortifications along the Limes Arabicus. I discussed this fortified desert frontier in Roman Arabia Petrea, protecting against nomadic incursions. as well as the Strata Diocletiana, the fortified military road built under Diocletian along the eastern border lined with the quadriburgia forts and milestones running from near Sura on the Euphrates through Palmyra and Damascus, to protecting the entire latitudinal length, while increasing troop deployments along the frontier. If you're interested in this frontier, I made a video about the troops stationed there in the 4th century, 4th, 5th century, according to the Notizia Dignitatum, right? So I will post it down below again in the top fixed comment as a link, so you can go check that out. Again, it would be very interesting to digress on how all these various provinces were manned as far as we know in chronological order. We will surely get there at some point. But it's the world, it's, as we said before, the broader political international situation really matters at the end of the day. So what do we get from these initial confrontations between the Romans and the Sasanians that will last until essentially the Islamic invasions? For this history of warfare chapter, I would like also to introduce a bit of sort of tactical features or broader military culture, so that we can tie this better with eventual videos on battles between the Romans and the Persians and other campaign history videos, because in these strategy-based ones, we don't talk too much in detail about warfare, we just hint at it. Throughout these long confrontations, the Sasanian military system displayed notoriously characteristics reminiscent of medieval feudalism, something that had historically stemmed from a step, in fact, estate concentration in the hands of these warlords that needed, in fact, sort of vast amount of lands in order to sustain their heavy cavalry. And with a scarce lower bases, as we've seen also in the video about Iranian tradition, there weren't even too many subjects to exploit in the Iranian plateau. There were more freemen to a degree, but also more sort of sparser. So cavalry was more important, and also, as you've seen, these guys had to get resources from other countries, as opposed to be more based in sort of more developed basins. That's why they searched for Mesopotamia as the basis of their state, right? Something very different from the Romans, or even from the Indian rulers, and the Chinese ones for sure. There was a small number of full-time high officers overseeing the levying and recruitment. There was some interesting military administration in the empire, well, especially in Mesopotamia, that had to put together also the logistics for the larger armies. The Iranian clans were more autonomous from that point of view. The core strength, in fact, lay in noble heavy cavalry, known as klibanari, that comes from the term grivan par, which means, having this collar protection. And the reason why the term klibanari came around in Latin to define these guys is that it's a nickname, right? So these were men encased in extensive armor that earned this Latin term suggesting oven-like heat, right? Because of sort of the term of the oven that resembled the sort of Persian one. That meant, however, we know that's something else. Also the term cataphracts, that is more generic, just means essentially heavily armored, but not necessarily. The klibanari were, in the Latin nickname, those guys probably fully cataphracted. Knight and horse, and depends also on the different degrees, because again, during the Sasanian times, the full, especially horse armor of the Arsacid era was halved tendentially. There are reasons for this today. I don't want to digress specifically on it because I already made a video about medieval, sort of ancient and medieval Eurasian steppes warfare that describes how, from the Sakas reacting to Alexander's Pezzetaroi heavy infantry, like the concept of the cataphract was born. It was mostly pioneered by the Arsacids, and by Sasanian times, the idea of having this guy hyper concentrated with even bows and armor, so shock and missile effect was split more effectively into more also agile units. The heavy cavalry from one side, the horse archery from another, in a more distinctively cooperating fashion was infantry. There were elephants, as we'll see now. So you didn't need to hyper concentrate everything in the cataphract. That still, however, was there. I mean, to some we don't know how long cataphracts kept existing. If you look at some medieval armor, you realize that there is some re-happening. We don't call them cataphracts, especially towards the later Middle Ages, but even there for hyper-specialization of the heavier type rather than something else. So it's something a bit counterintuitive here and there, but we should talk institutions, society, and this video is fairly long already the way it is. Definitely horse archers were all over the place, right? They supported the cataphracts. They enabled them to operate, creating confusion. The enemy coming, think about the famous Parthian shot. But mostly the tactics themselves, this hit and run, kind of arriving very close to the enemy, shooting their bows and withdrawing while shooting the bow. So that in rising, imagine also in this semi-arid territories, most of the times a great deal of dust that prevented probably the enemy from seeing who was behind, and not quite in the sense that the dust hit that, but because the preferred sort of tactical practice of these peoples was, as we've seen, it will continue over and over again against the Westerners who were heavier and stronger in that sense. We've seen it well at the Battle of Manzikert. Having, as it was normal really also on a regular basis, the battlefields that stretch for literally several kilometers. And so you wouldn't know if as you advance next to the next swarm of horse archers that you found during the day, it was finally the heavy, the cataphracts, right, that would smash at you. And very often the Persians, like also against the Romans, did not have that final destructive capacity as a wall. It was easier sort of to encircle the Romans if they fell into an ambush, right, and trying to essentially wearing them down. This is something we've seen, before with Valerian, for example, where also the general staff is captured. We've seen it even battles like the ones of Aten, that the Westerners, that's a Crusader era one, of course, but were capable of simply marching through, and then, if anything, at some point would be exhausted, worn out, but hardly like the weaker side in general. So these were relentless struggles. There were terrible means of also exhausting the enemy, such as lighting up fires along their ways, smoking them. If you were a horse archer from the other side, it's not like you were faring particularly well. Doing back and forth, even with a lighter horse, is exhausting to say the least. So these battles were a continuous iron arm contest. The Sasanian horse protection initially used leather, thick felt, and later incorporated partial metal components. The bulk of the infantry consisted of conscripted peasants equipped with basic spears and shields. These, again, were abundant, but you couldn't quite rely much on them. They were, in fact, often characterized by low morale and sometimes chained to prevent flight. This is something you see also during the Reconquista with the Black Guard, right, they were primarily used as camp laborers, siege workers, so sappers, pioneers, something like that, because they were not very much good to hold ground, especially against Roman troops that were professional. They're naturally also more aggressive. Auxiliaries like the Germans were definitely more tribally violent and aggressive than most of these levies. We should make some exception because we're talking about an immense territory, the Sasanians control. There are some, Caucasian, some Caspian. We're all pretty close to these areas, the Zagros Mountains, etc. Infantrymen, hillmen that are incredibly aggressive and effective. The Dailames, up to the arrival of the Seljuks, would be competitive against some of the best troops, even of the later Fatimid Caliphate, etc. So never underestimate moral forces as opposed to a particular type of equipment. But most, again, just because of the social, cultural nature of Sasanian Empire, most of these footmen were good for nothing, as opposed to the Roman infantry was pretty darn good. More effective light troops, at least including archers, slingers, and javelin skirmishers, were typically mercenaries from peripheral regions, supplemented by allied tribal light cavalry and even Indian elephants deployed for their psychological impact on enemy mounts and morale, right? Back in the day, I made a video, if I'm not wrong, about Sasanian tactics or something like that. We'll come back on them as well. But remember what we said before also regarding the northeastern frontier that we recently discussed so often on the channel. It was plenty of horse archers from the steppes proper that the Sasanians would use. That had been the case since ever. So these peoples in Tyrol came from there back in the day ancestrally, and even Achaemenid times you would find them, you find the Sakas, the Aryans in Greece during the Persian invasion. So it's that habitual for them, and there is, especially if there is to plunder, etc. Like these guys will arrive from the bowels of Central Asia just for the loot. You wouldn't even have to discipline them because they go in open order in swarms as light infantrymen. Just horsemen mostly. They're mountaineers, all right. But there is lots of, again, this light medium infantry from the rougher areas of the Masharek that is sort of a bit more aggressive and capable. I will not digress too much on Roman military doctrine at this point, because not just I made lots of videos about late Roman warfare already, but we can't simply make an entire thing now about it in this video alone. However, you know more or less what we're looking at this point. There's a continuous emphasis on disciplined heavy infantry. This will go on at least up to the mid-6th century, or slightly earlier if you're talking the Byzantine world in particular. We're talking the legionary infantry, essentially, with increasing incorporation, however, specialized light troops, such as the lanciari, armed with the versatile Naqsh-e spear, deriving from the fact that at this point, all the auxiliaries that Rome had of the directly controlled parts of the empire had been more or less Romanized. And so what you see here, also in the apparent lack of heavy infantry compared to previous times, is that it's not much a delusion, but the fact that you could afford to have the whole complete pack of tactical specialties that was not attributed to the auxiliaries only. Right? There are auxiliaries from the Simmacari, especially in the 3rd century, that come from outside the borders. They're mostly barbarian, like Germans. Again, are tough troops, mostly infantry as well. But the Romans start sort of tactically modulating their forces, both cavalry and infantry, in ways that they're ever more tactically complete, as at this point now Roman also subjects rather than citizens, especially after the 3rd century crisis, because of all the social worsening of the situation. So they will train their own rather than having some trooper, also because those ethnic specialties that the Romans had relied on from their allies that had ended up Romanizing and conquering had ended, because these guys had gentrified, had pacified them, so they were not specifically just apt to that. Just areas like, I don't know, North Africa were still savage enough to have like continuous supply of Berber horsemen, or something like that. The Mauryan cavalry was particularly specialized. The Germans also pretty darn good, like it has a heavy infantry. They're, again, not this overwhelming thing, but they're not a throwaway unit, but they're perfect for assaulting. They are brutal. They are sort of mentally wired in sort of a different way, and they also pay a very high tribute of blood for Rome, right? At this point, also legionary cavalry expands. Historically, this is a bit what we just said, like the foreign, the allies were providing with cavalry. And at this point, the Romans start basically having their own in larger quantities, larger proportions. There are the Equites Promoti, for example, that figure prominently also in the Notitia Dignitatum that we'll keep commenting on. And these changes allowed for more rapid closure with the enemy, reducing the effectiveness of Persian archery, especially in the east. There was a lot of that, so the Romans had to historically develop also more units, even recruited from the eastern provinces with, for example, composite bows that were typical of the area from quite a long time. There's a lot of similarity also between the Persian and, I don't know, the Sarmatian warfare of the previous centuries. There are helmet styles, for example, the so-called Levantine or the Syrian archer. People think, oh my god, the Romans had this and they looked like that. It comes from, and made a video about that, some iconography that, however, does not suggest that those guys were specifically Syrian or that the type of helmet was present just from there. Actually, we think they may have been Balkan helmets, and they had, in any case, something more to do with the steppes than with the Levant. But the Levant had been heavily Iranized, also through the Sasanian presence. But we're talking since the times of the Scythians and their raids across Mesopotamia. Think about the tactics against the Alans that are properly written down, like in the 2nd century, because of the incursions in Roman Anatolia from the steppes and so on. This is true also for the Gothic frontier, because as we see among the Goths, there are also lots of Iranic troops at the end of the day. Overall, of course, the Romans always had the same troops to do this, except before they were kind of more foreign, and now they're more universally empire, right? Imperial and Roman in kind. They would help taking advantage of favorable terrain, but as we've seen, it's almost about politics. It's about the general sentiment of the local populations, local alliances. The strategic dimension is mostly like the tip of the balance of this, in fact, international power ratio. The Sasanian ability to conduct sustained sieges now and audaciously parades repeatedly tested Roman resilience in open engagement and strategic recovery. The result was a rivalry marked by alternating periods of dominance, but characterized by profound mutual exhaustion across the 3rd century. As we've seen here, the heyday of this phase for the Sasanians is the crisis of the 3rd century. It was at large something internally triggered, right, as always for Rome. And so we see the Persians profiting from that, but was their military system actually more advanced than the Roman one? No, right? Even during, when the Romans were defeated, again, you can always get, and you will always get defeated at some point, but the question is, let's look at the comparative side and see who was actually the greater power out there, and for a reason, would military materialize. What to say? Well, I'm glad again that we covered this topic, because we haven't done much of this strategic inquiries. I'm glad to have talked more about the Sasanians as time passed. As you know, many videos that I make are also containing, and you can see it from the title, I do it from the tags normally. I say, well, in this video, I don't know, we talk about the Sasanians, we're talking, I don't know, about ancient cavalry warfare, whatever. But we need more stuff on the Sasanians, because they're objectively a very important topic. They had a hell of a military, probably the greatest military threat that the Romans faced, right, at this sort of point in history. And also for a long time, because they were around for quite a while. They're just a continuation of the Persian rivalry that the Romans had with the Sassanids before. It's just a dynastic change that brings to some others, but not the fact that we're talking essentially a Persian regional power. So far I made only 4 videos. This is the 5th about the Sasanians. And yeah, some of which were very old, right? But I'm glad that people liked this and that we had the capacity and possibility to discuss further this kind of clashes. I'm going to make also a bit more video about late antique warfare, migration era. We're still in Christmastide, and I normally do that. Then I don't know when we're going to come back to the more traditional lottery things, because there are actually pretty good videos that I prepared there and made in advance, something like 37 we have now, plus the others. But I prepared also some sort of fairly interesting stuff on top of that, and we're definitely gonna see lots of interesting content, and it never ends. You see, these are not some desperate ways of saying, okay, oh my god, I have to cover more stuff that they like. No, this is infinite. It never ends. My greatest challenge is picking the right the topic that I know in the moment can be more relatable, more sort of vibing with the audience, but also covering everything, like being homogeneous. And so the The point is which one I make, because also they are pretty beautiful topics. I mean, I personally enjoy making video about them. You learn a lot yourself when you do this stuff. All right. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.